It's time for another Reader's Vlog, the series of videos where I give you an update on the books that I've been reading and how I've been getting on with them, and it's also a chance for you to discuss the books that you've been reading with me down in the comments. I've had a pretty good month for reading, a couple of books that I've read before, one that I gave up on and now I'm retrying it, and a couple of new books as well. And I wanted to start with the book that I gave up on previously, because that is going to be a somewhat controversial book, because it's The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Yes, I know it's one of the most famous fantasy books of all time, if not the most famous one. People rave about it, I really enjoy the films, but when I read this book, it must have been 3 or 4 years ago now, and I also read a little bit of The Two Towers, I think. I just wasn't wowed by this book or series very much at all. It was fine enough to read, but I didn't connect with the characters, these characters that I've heard so much about, being very deep characters with very rich relationships. I didn't connect with the world. I don't know what it was, maybe it was just at the time it just wasn't appropriate for me to read it. I don't know what it was. But it might also be that when I first read it, I was reading it on the page, and this time I've been listening to it on audiobook. And as I've said many times, sometimes that can make all the difference with a novel. If you're not enjoying it with reading on the page, try an audiobook and see if it changes your mind, because for me, it's brought The Lord of the Rings to life. I've really been enjoying the book. I am now at the bit where they have just reached Rivendell, so we've had the stuff with Tom Bombadil, we've had their travels, and I actually am starting to see the rich detail both in the world and the characters as Tolkien is telling his story. And I have no idea how I managed to miss this the first time that I read it. Perhaps I was reading it too quickly, or I just wasn't paying careful attention enough. But it is such a detailed, complex world. Even something that I didn't like the first time that I read it, for example, like the constant poems and singing, it actually makes sense in the story, and it actually gives the characters a certain kind of life that they might not get otherwise. You know, it really embeds you in the culture and the way these characters behave when they're singing these songs and they're connected to the arts in their world. It's just some kind of detail that is often missing from a lot of novels, really. And so even though it was something that I just glossed over the first time that I read them, this time it's become one of the things that I've enjoyed the most. I also like that Tolkien takes his time to really build the story. You know, in the films, for example, you know, by necessity, a lot of the early parts of the book are truncated or cut entirely, like Tom Bombadil, for example. And I can see why they would cut that, because it's not necessarily, at least to me, it doesn't seem integral to the world per se, but it does add this richness to the story. It does give the characters a little bit more time to flesh out in terms of their relationships as well. And it's just a kind of depth that was completely lacking from the films, which isn't to say that the films are bad, because they're very good adaptations. So I think I'm about a third of the way through. I think that's roughly where Rivendell is in terms of the overall story. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm hoping that this momentum keeps going and that I'll be able to surpass the bit very early on in The Two Towers where I gave up last time, because I would like to finally say that I've read The Lord of the Rings, and luckily this time I'm enjoying it a lot more, so we'll see how we go with that one. Another book that is a reread, but this time it's a reread that I was looking forward to, and that is Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. I'm still quite high from enjoying the series and the conclusion in the end, so I thought while I was still feeling quite positive about the series, I would go back and read the first book again. I'm also watching the TV series at long last, and it's interesting to watch the show alongside the book. And I have to say that as much as I like the show as a sort of independent work of art, I don't think it's a very good adaptation of Interview with the Vampire at all, and I do think that it's a little bit insulting in some ways as well. This is something that I think I will make a video on, about Into the Vampire as an adaptation, because I do think it fundamentally fails in a lot of ways, even if I can recognise that as a sort of independent story, it's still reasonably good, although I do have some issues with it. Nevertheless, when it comes to Interview with the Vampire, the story, it was nice just to go back to basics with Rice, where she's not lost in her characters and her world and mythology, and she's just focusing on this much more intimate story about Louis, focusing on the mythology of the vampire just in terms of, you know, what it is like to be an immortal being, and focusing on those sort of fundamental existential and moral and religious questions that sometimes she moves away from in the later books. So it was nice and refreshing just to go back to that original book, and it still holds up, and actually I think it may be my favourite book in the series, but we'll see. I think I'm going to try and read as many of the Chronicles as I can, see how far I can get before I get tired again. So I'll see how we go, but at the minute I'm feeling that Into the Vampire might be my favourite of them. There was also some things that I was starting to pick up on this read that I hadn't picked up on before, having read the whole series. And these are small things, but for example, the relationship between Louis and Claudia. I always, took that more from Louis' perspective, especially before I read some of the later books, where I thought that they really did have this bond. But there are parts of the book where it really just seemed like Louis is not assessing his relationship with Claudia properly at all. There are moments where it seems like she is manipulating him and he just doesn't see it. And it was interesting to think about that as to whether Rice is trying already at this stage to use the unreliable narrator to sort of convey that Louis might already be delusional about his relationship to Claudia, or maybe it's just backwards projection, because knowing where things end up, and obviously there's Claudia's ghost in Merrick that tells Louis how much she hates him, all these things might then cloud an earlier reading. But at the very least, it's nice to see that you can actually, having read the whole series, see the ways in which Louis is misinterpreting things for things that happen later on. That being said, there are some things that are completely bizarre, like for example, Lestat's behaviour in this book. I think it's reasonable to blame Louis as an unreliable narrator with respect to some things, but Lestat is very cruel to some of these characters, and I know that Rice retcons this by saying that Lestat's victims were always evildoers and Louis just didn't want to hear it or whatever, but I'm just not convinced that is very convincing or compelling. I think it would have been much better for Rice maybe to have just had Lestat going through a bit of a dark period at this point and accepting some of what Louis said about him as true, rather than trying to come up with these convoluted things later on. Fortunately, that doesn't really damage this novel, because it does sort of sit on its own as a complete piece of work, and it was intended as one. So it's nice that the problems with the later books don't tar this original first one. Next up, I've been carrying on my watching of all of the Shakespeare plays, still on the next batch of history plays, and we watched Henry IV Part 1, which is, one of the great Shakespeare plays. For many people, it's the greatest Shakespeare history play. It tells the story of Falstaff and Prince Hal being the son of Henry IV, who's a bit wayward. He's sort of hanging around with these ruffians, and it's essentially a story of Hal being forced into a situation where he has to accept responsibility as a prince to fight in a war, and we see him slowly sort of move away from Falstaff throughout the play as he becomes a more responsible person. Now, comparing this play to the earlier Shakespeare histories, in a lot of ways it's a lot less political and a lot more personal, and that could be a good or a bad thing depending on your perspective. My partner, for example, really likes Henry VI. He thinks it's a great play, and that one is much more focused on the politics, sort of, Machiavellian, Game of Thrones style thing, if you want a modern reference point there. Whereas Henry IV, it does have that political stuff, but it also really is just focused on Falstaff the character, his relationship with Hal, and in some ways it's a little bit slower and meandering for that. So I think if you like a character play, I can see why Henry IV would be a great one, whereas if you prefer something that's a little bit more political and less character driven, I could see why you'd prefer the other histories. For me, I really enjoyed this play. I thought that Falstaff's hilarious as a character, and oftentimes in Shakespeare it is quite difficult for a lot of the comedy to land. I like some of Shakespeare's comedies, but I always find them at best just pleasant. I can smile as I'm watching them and just feel sort of calm, and it's nice, but I never, you're rarely going to belly laugh at a Shakespearean joke. But Falstaff, especially with the actor who played him in the BBC adaptation that I watched, he was able to bring out those laughs. And it's nice to see that there are some examples of Shakespearean comedy where those jokes can still land. And a lot of that is just to do with the character of Falstaff, that's just this absurd, man telling these high tales that are just completely fabricated, has a very high opinion of himself, this egomaniac almost. And it's great. It's a very unique Shakespearean character that he really doesn't do anywhere else in his plays, which again makes sense as to why this play stands out, because it seems to me so far anyway to be unique among the histories, unique among the more comedic plays. So it's just got something, this unique slant to it that I don't think is matched by any other Shakespeare play really. If you've read or watched Henry IV Part 1, let me know what you thought of it. I know that Part 2 is meant to be somewhat of a letdown, at least according to some, although Harold Bloom, whose book I'm reading along with watching these plays, he does hold that these two plays, along with Henry V, are kind of the high watermark of Shakespeare's work. So let me know in the comments whether you agree with that sentiment, or is it just this one and the other two are a bit naff. And lastly, I've been carrying on my reading of Dickens novels, and I'm finally onto one that I didn't really know much about before, and that is Barnaby Rudge, his 5th novel in publishing order. But I believe actually Dickens had started this book very early, perhaps even first in his career, but due to various delays, it took him a very long time to get this book out. And I also believe it was regarded as his first sort of flop. It didn't sell as well as his other books, and I can see why, as I'm reading it, why that would be the case, because up to this point you have Dickens really bringing these larger-than-life characters. So in Mr. Pickwick, Pickwick Papers, you have Mr. Pickwick, this larger-than-life, ridiculous man going on these crazy adventures. Then you have these sort of coming-of-age stories with characters like Nicholas Nickleby, or you have the Old Curiosity Shop with Little Nell, and Oliver Twist. All of those characters sort of, they have either these ridiculously tragic stories, or they just have very strong personalities, so they really come through and it drives the narrative. Whereas in Barnaby Rudge, it sort of sets itself up in a very different way. You begin with this scene in this inn, and there's the innkeeper there and a few other people, patrons, and they're telling the story of this grisly murder that happened. There's Barnaby himself, and he has this pet raven that's sort of kooky but also a little bit dark. There's something a little bit insidious and creepy about Barnaby Rudge, and it's not something that Dickens is new to, because he's done this before in some of the short stories that he wrote, in some of the interludes to novels like the Pickwick Papers. There were these dark little stories that characters sometimes tell within the main narrative, but it's definitely a different vibe from those other Dickens books, which, at least in terms of their general structure, are a little bit formulaic, in that at least with 3 of them it's a sort of coming-of-age story of a child, at least in part, or the adventures of a child growing up, at least in part. So it's interesting to see him shifting. I can't say exactly what my views on Barnaby Rudge are. I will say that I started this book, read about 3 chapters, stalled in my reading a little bit, and then I had to go back and read it again because I couldn't remember what was happening. But now that I'm reading it a little bit more consistently, I'm holding, I'm able to pay attention to what's going on a bit more, and I am enjoying it, but I don't have any strong views on it yet. It's not grabbed me immediately like Nicholas Nickleby did, but it's also not put me off. So we'll see how we go with Barnaby Rudge. It's a long book, so it'll be a while, I think, before I get round to finishing it. Dickens really does like to go on, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. But yeah, we'll see how we get on with that one. If you've read Barnaby Rudge, though, let me know. What do you think of it? Do you think it's a worthy entry in Dickens' bibliography, or do you think it sort of deserves its place as one of his lesser novels, as it typically is considered to be one of his weaker ones? Alright, that is it for this little update on the books that I've been reading this month. Let me know down in the comments, what have you been reading? If you've read any of these books, what did you think of them? Did you enjoy them? Did you dislike them, and why? Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.